The Book of Genesis does not open like a collection of spiritual metaphors. In its oldest surviving form, the Masoretic text, it reads like a cold, anomalous dataset. It is a rigid ledger of names, lineages, and highly specific numbers, carefully copied by scribes who treated the math as something sacred. But the numbers refuse to behave. They describe lifespans that break every known law of modern biology, presenting a timeline that the official version of history simply cannot accommodate. Today, the human body hits a hard biological wall. If you are incredibly fortunate, you might live for 80, perhaps 90 years before your cellular engine quietly winds down. Our entire civilization is built around this brief, fleeting window. We measure history in tiny increments, assuming that our current biological limit is the only one that has ever existed. Now contrast that with the concept of living for nearly 1,000 years. It is not just a longer life. It is an entirely different mode of existence. It suggests centuries of continuous memory, uninterrupted cellular repair, and a physical resilience that stretches far beyond our current comprehension. Mainstream science tells us to look at these pre-flood lifespans as religious allegory. We are told they are poetic exaggerations, primitive attempts to honor ancient tribal leaders by inflating their ages. But the text itself does not read like poetry. It reads like a literal, uncorrupted genetic history. It documents the original human blueprint operating exactly as it was designed. It describes a biological baseline of extreme longevity, functioning perfectly in an environment that no longer exists, long before a catastrophic reset forced a global change. To see the pattern clearly, we have to shift our perspective. We must step away from the safe, sterile framing of academic mythology. When we stop treating the Genesis timeline as a theological fable and start looking at it as a physical reality, the entire picture changes. It stops being a religious story. It becomes a medical record. It becomes the documentation of a species operating at full capacity. And the most compelling evidence for this is the math itself. The numbers recorded in the Genesis dataset are not round symbolic figures. They are highly specific, almost uncomfortably precise. 895, 912, 930. These are not the clean, poetic numbers of a mythmaker trying to invent a legend. They are the irregular, jagged data points of a biological reality that we have lost. They track a continuous, unbroken physical capacity that was suddenly and violently capped. For generations, we have been taught to ignore our own ancestral records. We have been trained by modern institutions to dismiss the most profound physical claim of the ancient world as nothing more than a childish myth. But this timeline is not a fairy tale, it is a physical trace. It is the surviving memory of a deactivated human capacity written down by people who were watching their own biology slowly collapse. They were recording the fading echoes of a golden age, leaving a warning for the generations that would inherit a broken world. To understand exactly what broke inside the human genome, we have to look at the absolute peak of that timeline. We have to examine the ultimate anomaly in this ancient dataset. We must look at a single data point that pushes the boundaries of cellular biology to their absolute limit, a figure whose very name has become synonymous with the impossible, a man named Methuselah. According to the Masoretic text of the Book of Genesis, his lifespan is recorded with a cold, unnerving precision. Methuselah lived for 969 years. This number is not presented as a loose estimation. It is not framed as a spiritual metaphor or a poetic exaggeration. It is written down as a strict, unyielding chronological coordinate in a ledger of human history. To understand the sheer physical weight of 9 centuries, you have to measure it against our own fragile historical memory. Imagine a single human life beginning during the Norman conquest of England in the year 1066. And ending only today. Imagine one mind remaining intact while witnessing the building of medieval stone cathedrals, the long shadows of the Renaissance, the smoke of the Industrial Revolution, and the birth of the atomic age. Picture one physical body absorbing all of those changing seasons, continually repairing its own tissues and stubbornly refusing to break down. Modern biology insists that aging is simply an inevitable accumulation of cellular damage. Over time, our genetic replication becomes sloppy. Our DNA degrades and our cellular engines quietly fail. But the ancient dataset describes a biological machine that simply did not degrade. It points to a physical state where cellular repair mechanisms continuously outpaced decay for almost a millennium. Methuselah's extreme age is not described as a divine miracle. It acts as the textual footprint of an active, uncorrupted human genome, operating exactly as it was originally designed. For centuries, we have been conditioned to read these ancient texts strictly as religious mythology. We blur the numbers to make them feel safe, downgrading them into symbolic fables because the alternative is fundamentally terrifying. But if you strip away the theological fog, you are left with a raw medical anomaly. The ancient scribes were not writing spiritual poetry about extreme longevity. They were preserving a literal biological logbook of a vanished world. They were documenting a physical capacity for life that humanity no longer possesses. And then, the timeline reveals a strange and highly specific detail. The numbers within this ancient ledger are not just a static record of long lives. They form a deliberate, moving sequence. If you map the chronology of the patriarchs year by year, Methuselah's 969 years of life end precisely in the exact year that the global floodwaters arrive. The math perfectly aligns. His cellular engine did not slowly wind down from natural exhaustion. His biological timeline was abruptly terminated, ending simultaneously with the old world itself. This alignment forces a profound shift in how we must view our own bodies. The fragile 80-year limit we accept today is not the triumphant peak of human evolution. It is the degraded aftermath of a shattered era. Our current biological capacity is merely a fractured, deactivated remnant of the original human blueprint. We are living in a compromised physical vessel, operating on a fraction of our ancestral power. But if Methuselah represents the absolute peak of this surviving biological capacity, he was not the one who created it. To understand how this genetic inheritance began, we have to look backward down the timeline. We have to trace the bloodline to the very origin of the documented world. We must ask if this impossible cellular endurance was present from the very beginning, anchored in the uncorrupted biology of the first generation, starting with a man named Adam. The Genesis ledger records that Adam lived for 930 years. We are deeply conditioned to reject a number like that the moment we hear it. Modern education teaches us to imagine the earliest periods of human history as an era of immense physical fragility. We are taught to picture the first humans huddled in cold environments, battling constant disease, suffering from malnutrition, and succumbing to old age by their 30th or 40th winter. We view the dawn of humanity as a time of short, brutal, and terrifyingly brief lives. The underlying assumption is always the exact same, that human biology was weak in the beginning, and that it has slowly improved over thousands of years to give us the 80-year lifespans we enjoy today. But the oldest surviving textual records describe a completely different reality. They present a time when the human physical form was a biological fortress. They describe an era when the first generation possessed the original, uncorrupted human blueprint. In this ancient architecture, the human genome operated with fully active longevity pathways. Cellular degradation, the slow accumulation of genetic errors that we now call aging, simply did not function the way it does now. The physical body was capable of near-perfect, continuous repair over centuries. This extreme endurance was not a miraculous exception granted to a single founder. It was the standard biological baseline for an entire age of humanity. The Masoretic text is mathematically relentless about this point. Adam lived for 930 years. His son, Seth, lived for 912 years. Seth's son, Enosh, lived for 905 years. Canaan lived for 910 years. Mahalalel lived for 895 years. These are not random figures thrown together to create a poetic myth. They represent a stable, repeating data set. For generation after generation, the raw physical capacity of the human body effortlessly crossed the threshold of 8 centuries. They were born with a genetic inheritance that simply did not know how to fail. But as you read further down the ancient ledger, a dark, unmistakable pattern begins to emerge. The numbers do not remain perfectly stable forever, and the biological degradation did not happen through a sudden random flaw. The timeline documents a tracked, gradual decay. The original physical blueprint was beginning to fray. The capacity for extreme age was slowly slipping away, dropping by small architectural increments generation by generation, as if an invisible accumulating weight was being placed on the human genome. The early scribes were not just recording ages, they were documenting the slow, agonizing collapse of their own biology. This realization completely inverts how we view our place in the historical timeline. We have always assumed that modern humans are the absolute pinnacle of biological development, standing triumphant at the summit of a long, upward evolutionary climb. But the ancient texts insist that we have the story entirely backward. We are not the pinnacle. We are the degraded remnants of a biologically superior origin. We are the survivors of a massive genetic collapse, living out our short 80-year lives inside the deeply compromised ruins of a much greater physical architecture. Something terrible happened to that original genetic blueprint. Something fundamentally broke the baseline of human longevity, and the ancients did not just blindly suffer through this biological collapse, they anticipated it. To understand what triggered the destruction of the first generation's physical capacity, we have to look at the people who saw the end approaching. We have to examine a sudden, violent break in the timeline, a strange anomaly in the dataset, and the highly specific prophetic warning hidden deep within the bloodline of a man named Enoch. We follow the bloodline down from Adam. We trace the unbroken pattern of 9-century lifespans, moving generation by generation through the ancient ledger. The numbers remain impossibly high. The biological baseline holds steady. And then we hit a sudden, jarring interruption in the data. The 7th generation belongs to a man named Enoch, but unlike his ancestors, Enoch's timeline does not end in natural biological decay. The text records that he lived for 365 years, and then he simply vanished. He was abruptly removed from the physical record. The text does not say he died of old age or disease. It states that he was taken, but before his sudden departure, Enoch left behind a son, and this is exactly where the ancient ledger stops acting like a simple family tree. A normal genealogy merely lists ancestors to establish a claim to land or a throne, but this specific lineage completely changes its function. It begins to operate like a mechanical countdown clock. Enoch named his son Methuselah. In the ancient Hebrew roots, that name is not just a traditional family identifier, it carries a terrifying, highly specific meaning. When carefully translated, the root words form a clear sentence. His death shall bring it. It was not a title, it was a deadline. The ancients were not merely passing down a name to the next generation. They were initiating a mathematical prophecy of a global cataclysm. For centuries, this specific detail has been buried under thick layers of theology. Modern scholars tend to dismiss it as religious symbolism or a poetic myth added by later scribes. But if you strip away the mysticism, a completely different picture emerges. If you look at the raw data preserved in the Masoretic text, you see a precise mechanism at work. Enoch's bloodline was tracking a hard physical timeline. Every passing year of Methuselah's impossibly long life was another tick on a biological clock. This reveals something profoundly unsettling about the world before the flood. The impending deluge was not a random natural disaster. It was not a sudden, unpredictable shift in the Earth's climate that caught humanity by surprise. It was a known, anticipated event. The extreme lifespans of these early generations were being actively used as a living calendar. They were marking the exact moment when a deliberate global purge would finally begin. The ancients knew the genetic reset was coming. They understood that their uncorrupted biology, their 9-century capacity for life, was about to be violently erased from the earth. They could see the bottleneck approaching, and rather than carving that warning into stone, they embedded it directly into their own bloodlines. They left a ticking clock in the text for anyone who knew how to read the numbers. The record of their lives was simultaneously the record of their impending destruction. To see exactly how accurate that countdown was, we do not need to look at myths. We only need to follow the math. We have to move exactly one generation forward in the ledger. We must look at Methuselah's son, a man named Lamech, because Lamech's timeline provides the final, undeniable proof of exactly what the ancients were waiting for. The ancient ledger records that Lamech lived for 777 years. On its own, this number looks like another impossible anomaly. It looks like a fragmented piece of a broken timeline, easily dismissed by modern historians. But Lamech is different. His lifespan is not just a raw measurement of biological endurance, it is a highly specific mathematical coordinate. To understand the chilling reality of this number, you have to follow the generational math written directly into the text. Lay the numbers out side by side. Lamech is born. He lives for 182 years. Then he has a son named Noah. Lamech continues to live for exactly 595 more years. You add those two numbers together, you get 777. That is his precise age at death. Now, look at the timeline of his son. Genesis explicitly records that the global deluge begins in the exact 600th year of Noah's life. Do the math. 182 plus 600 equals 782. Lamech dies at 777. This means that exactly 5 years before the most destructive cataclysm in human history, the final patriarch of the ancient world is quietly removed from the board. His father Methuselah dies the very year the waters arrive. The alignment is absolute. The math is perfectly flush against the arrival of the floodwaters. This is not a random collection of mythological ages. This is a cold, calculated countdown. The timeline tracks the systematic removal of the uncorrupted genome. Every passing generation is a ticking clock. The numbers dictate the pauses. The ancients were not merely keeping records of their ancestors, they were actively documenting a terminal horizon. They knew a hard biological boundary was approaching. They watched the final pieces of their world fall into place right before the breaking of the sky. We find this chilling precision preserved entirely within the Masoretic text of Genesis. Modern science often tries to soften these exact numbers. They attempt to downgrade them into safe academic metaphors. They argue that these extreme ages are just symbolic poetry or a misunderstanding of ancient lunar calendars. But the physical text resists that kind of safe interpretation. The math is far too rigid. The chronological interlocking of births, lifespans, and deaths operates like a mechanical gear system. It behaves like a physical ledger. When you look at this mathematical alignment, the implications completely shatter our comfortable version of human history. The texts suggest that these extreme lifespans were biologically real, but their disappearance was not natural. The loss of this immense physical capacity was not the result of a slow, gradual evolutionary decay. These lifespans were intentionally terminated. The human genome was subjected to a violent external intervention. The ancient biology was functioning perfectly, right up until the exact moment a cataclysmic event swept across the Earth. The timeline was not just recording ages, it was documenting the violent end of an entire era of human biology. It was counting down to a deliberate biological reset. The capacity to live for nearly 1,000 years was systematically pushed to the edge of the floodwaters, and then it was permanently erased. We are left with a terrifying realization. We are not the pinnacle of an upward evolutionary climb. We are the degraded, short-lived survivors of a global purge. But a skeptic might still argue that this is just one book. They might claim that this impossible countdown is entirely isolated to the Hebrew texts, a localized tradition born in a single culture. If this genetic reset actually happened on a global scale, if human biology was truly operating under entirely different rules before a planetary flood, we should expect to find the exact same numbers recorded somewhere else. We should expect to find this identical anomaly written in the clay of a completely disconnected civilization. So, did anyone else record this exact same countdown? Inside a quiet display case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford sits a four-sided block of baked clay. It is known as the Weld-Blundell prism. It does not begin like a myth. It is a physical, tactile artifact, covered in the dense wedge-shaped strokes of ancient cuneiform script. Officially, this object is a localized copy of the Sumerian King List. It was inscribed by a scribe in the ancient city of Larsa, thousands of miles away from the Hebrew scholars who carefully guarded the book of Genesis. You are looking at the foundational records of a completely different civilization. The ancient Mesopotamians and the early Hebrews did not share the same theology, the same language, or the same geographical borders. Yet when you place this block of clay next to the Masoretic text, something deeply unsettling happens. The structural architecture of their history is completely identical. Both texts present a chronological timeline starting at the dawn of humanity, and both texts record an initial era where the human lifespan defies every known law of modern cellular biology. As you read down the columns of the Weld-Blundell prism, the scribe lists the earliest rulers of the earth. The numbers are staggering. Kings are recorded as reigning for tens of thousands of years. One ruler is documented holding power for 28,800 years. Another rules for 36,000 years. It reads like a continuous, unbroken era of extreme biological endurance, stretching out for vast periods of time. And then, exactly like the Genesis countdown, the clay tablet hits a sudden, violent boundary. The scribe presses a highly specific phrase into the clay. The text reads, "The flood swept over." Immediately after that line, the impossibly high numbers shatter and the recorded lifespans suddenly collapse. We are now looking at completely disconnected ancient cultures, separated by vast distances and entirely different worldviews, confirming the precise same impossible anomaly. Both traditions document a hyperextended biological baseline that is forcibly terminated by a global deluge. They agree on the sequence. They agree on the catastrophe. And they agree that the human physical form never recovered its original capacity after the waters receded. The standard academic response is to treat these numbers as a shared cultural metaphor. We are told to dismiss the tens of thousands of years as symbolic exaggeration, a primitive attempt to legitimize early dynasties, or a simple misunderstanding of ancient lunar calendars. But when you look at the physical reality of the clay and the rigid, accounting-style precision of the ancient scribes, that safe explanation begins to feel entirely too small. This is not a shared mythological poem. It reads as a literal surviving record of a pre-cataclysmic human genome. The clean, orthodox version of the human timeline is painfully incomplete. The artifacts left behind quietly insist that a massive, species-wide biological reset occurred. What we are seeing across these disconnected cultures is a shared global memory. It is the physical documentation of a time when human biology operated under entirely different, vastly superior rules. A time when the cellular engine did not rapidly degrade and burn out. But if this ancient genetic reality was so universally known, what happened to it as history moved forward? Did later ancient historians attempt to clean up the records and erase these impossible numbers to make the timeline look more rational? To find out, we have to move forward into the Hellenistic era. We must look at how later scholars handled this exact same data by examining the surviving work of a highly educated Babylonian priest named Berossus. Berossus lived in the 3rd century before Christ. He was a high-ranking Babylonian priest, a scholar of the Hellenistic era, and a man with direct access to the deepest, most guarded archives of the Temple of Marduk. When he was tasked with translating the ancient records of Mesopotamia into Greek, he produced a monumental work known as the Babyloniaca. Today, modern academics tend to treat his work as a collection of localized folklore. They classify him as a mythmaker, but that is not how Berossus operated, and it is certainly not how he viewed his own material. He was a strict, meticulous historian. He was the custodian of physical clay archives that were already considered ancient in his own time. His primary job was to preserve the literal timeline of a civilization that was quickly being absorbed by the expanding Greek world. And when he sat down to translate the ancient king lists, he did something that deeply frustrates modern scholars. He did not filter out the impossible numbers. He firmly defended them. In the Babyloniaca, Berossus documents a highly specific mathematical chronology of the distant past. He records exactly 10 pre-flood kings. And he states, as a matter of unquestioned historical fact, that these 10 kings ruled for a combined total of 432,000 years. He meticulously documents this vast, stretching era of extreme human endurance, tracking the succession of power right up to the reign of the 10th king, a ruler named Xisuthros. And it is during this 10th reign that Berossus writes down the exact same historical boundary line found in the Hebrew texts. The great deluge arrives, the waters rise, and the uncorrupted world is violently swept away. By preserving these exact towering numbers, Berossus does something highly uncomfortable for the modern historical narrative. He directly validates the data carved into the Weld-Blundell prism. He proves that the Sumerian King List was never an isolated, exaggerated poem or a localized error. It was the heavily guarded, institutional consensus of the ancient world. The scholars, priests, and archivists of antiquity looked at these massive lifespans and recognized them as their own literal heritage. They cross-referenced the data, preserved the math, and passed it forward. The institutional erasure of these timelines is an entirely modern invention. Today, we simply cross out the numbers we do not like. We downgrade the math to metaphors, or we dismiss it as a translation error, simply because a timeline spanning hundreds of thousands of years completely shatters our standard model of a slow, upward biological evolution. But the ancient historians did not possess that arrogance. They accepted the math because they knew the biological reset was a physical reality. Our ancestors fully understood that they were living in the shadow of a biologically superior past. They firmly believed they were the degraded remnants of a much older, long-lived race. They knew they were walking through the fractured remains of a world where the human cellular engine was somehow capable of lasting for tens of thousands of years, right up until the environment fundamentally broke. But if this planetary flood actually triggered a hard biological reset, we should be able to see the immediate physical aftermath. We should not just find stories of receding water and surviving boats. We should see a mathematically precise collapse in the human lifespan, documented generation by generation, right as the new world begins. To find that proof, we have to cross the boundary of the cataclysm. We must look at exactly what happened to human biology the exact moment the floodwaters finally dropped. The moment the floodwaters drop, the biological architecture of the human species shatters. The 9-century baseline, the uncorrupted physical standard that held steady from Adam to Lamech, abruptly ceases to exist. As we track the genealogies in the book of Genesis emerging into the post-cataclysmic world, the numbers begin to plummet. We see the lifespan of Noah's immediate descendants drop from over 900 years, down into the 400-year range, and then rapidly into the 200s. Within just a few documented generations, we arrive at a man named Abraham, whose life ends at exactly 175 years. If you take these descending ages and plot them on a graph, you do not get a random scattering of mythological numbers. You get a terrifyingly precise visual geometry. It forms a steep, mathematically consistent biological decay curve. It looks exactly like a chart tracking the failure of a complex mechanical system. With every passing generation, the cellular engine loses its capacity to repair itself. The numbers fall in a curved trajectory that any modern geneticist or statistician would instantly recognize as a system engaged in a rapid, irreversible collapse. This multi-generational freefall is recorded not just in the Hebrew texts. The remaining fragments of the Sumerian and Babylonian records mirror the exact same collapse. The kings who rule immediately after the deluge no longer reign for tens of thousands of years. Their numbers shrink drastically, matching the same sudden, violent downward trajectory. Across completely disconnected cultures, the texts reveal the exact same phenomenon. The survivors of the cataclysm were passing down a broken genetic inheritance. Each new generation was born with less vitality, less endurance, and a faster cellular countdown than the parents who conceived them. We have been deeply conditioned to look at the modern human lifespan, 70 or 80 years, as a natural, evolutionary constant. We assume that our bodies wear out because that is simply what biology does. We look at an ancient figure living for 175 years and assume the text is merely exaggerating a normal, ordinary life. But the ancient scribes were not recording a gradual evolutionary achievement. They were documenting a tragedy in real time. What you are reading in these ancient ledgers is not the natural process of human aging. It is the terrifying real-time documentation of a massive genetic bottleneck. The texts are describing a biological species that has just passed through an environmental trauma so severe that its fundamental DNA was physically altered. The protective environment that previously sustained extreme longevity had been violently stripped away. The survivors were thrust into a hostile new world, and their bodies were forced to adapt by discarding the very mechanisms that once kept them alive for centuries. The global cataclysm did not just wash away a physical civilization, it permanently shattered the human genome's capacity for extreme endurance. It broke the biological clock. The original blueprint of human biology was lost in the floodwaters, replaced by a degraded, highly vulnerable adaptation. The human form survived, but the capacity for near immortality was forcibly deactivated. But a decay curve does not fall forever into nothingness. Eventually, a collapsing system has to hit a floor. The genetic freefall had to reach a point of rigid stabilization, a final limit where the new, degraded rules of human biology would be permanently locked into place. To find exactly where this multi-generational collapse finally flatlined, we have to follow the math down the timeline. We have to follow the curve until it hits a hard, unnatural wall, ending with a man named Moses. The Masoretic text records the death of Moses at exactly 120 years. For thousands of years, this specific age has been deeply wrapped in theology. We are taught to view Moses purely as a prophet, a lawgiver, a man standing on a mountain holding tablets of stone. But if we strip away the religious narrative, if we remove the mythology and look only at the cold numbers recorded in the ancient ledger, Moses becomes something entirely different. He is no longer just a historical figure. He is the final, stabilized data point on a collapsing biological curve. The mathematical decay that began immediately after the floodwaters receded does not continue dropping infinitely. It eventually stabilizes. From the original 9th-century baseline, the numbers plummeted into the 400s, then the 200s, passing through Abraham at 175, until the generational freefall finally hit a rigid, impenetrable boundary. At 120 years, the collapse stops. The numbers flatline. The lifespan of Moses represents the exact moment where the new, degraded rules of human biology became permanent. Think of this not as natural aging, but as a newly imposed, hard-coded limit on a complex biological system. In modern engineering, when a machine is pushed into a new environment, a governor is often installed. A governor is a physical limitation placed on an engine to restrict its maximum speed, preventing it from operating beyond a strictly defined parameter. The 120-year cap behaves exactly like this. It does not look like a natural, random biological variation. It looks like a hard boundary suddenly programmed into the cellular architecture, preventing the human machine from ever running past a specific, predetermined expiration date. This kind of sudden universal limitation does not align with the slow, blind crawl of natural evolution. Natural selection does not arbitrarily decide that a highly successful, long-lived species should suddenly lose nearly 8 centuries of its lifespan in just a few generations. Evolution builds slowly. It does not drop a mathematically precise guillotine on a species' cellular endurance. This 120-year flatline implies something much darker. It points to a rapid environmental trauma or a forced genetic degradation violently imposed upon the human physical form. We are currently living inside the absolute boundaries of that exact same flatline. Today, when modern biology marvels at a rare individual reaching 100 or 110 years of age, we believe we are witnessing the ultimate triumph of modern medicine and lifestyle. We are not. We are simply bumping up against the ceiling of a shattered biological architecture. Our current, fleeting lifespan is not the natural, healthy baseline of our species. It is the degraded aftermath of a global genetic collapse. We are walking around in compromised vessels, permanently capped at a mere fraction of our original ancestral potential. But a hard-coded limit requires a mechanism. A biological boundary this precise does not simply materialize out of thin air. If this 120-year cap was not the result of natural evolution, then how was it established? Who or what programmed this physical hard stop into the human genome? To find the answer, we have to leave the mathematical abstract and look for a concrete physical trace. We must travel to the Judean desert, to the ancient, crumbling parchment fragments recovered from the caves of Qumran. We have to look closely at the Dead Sea Scrolls to read the explicit external decree that forced this physical limit upon the world. Deep inside the limestone caves of Qumran, ancient scribes hid the fractured remnants of a forgotten world. Among the thousands of brittle parchment pieces recovered from the Judean desert, there are specific, highly guarded fragments of the Book of Genesis. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are not abstract mathematical models, and they are not vague cultural myths. They are physical documents written in iron gall ink on animal skin, preserving a very specific verse, Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. For centuries, theologians have read this specific verse as a moral judgment, a spiritual boundary placed upon a wicked generation. But if you read the ancient Hebrew through the lens of modern cellular biology, the tone changes completely. It sounds terrifyingly like a system administrator typing a new, hard-coded limitation directly into a master terminal. It reads like a sudden, irreversible downgrade of the human operating system. The text records an explicit, authoritative decree made just moments before the arrival of the global floodwaters. It states clearly that the days of man shall be exactly 120 years. It does not say that humanity will gradually evolve into a shorter lifespan over thousands of generations. It does not suggest a gentle, natural adaptation to a changing climate. It presents a hard, inflexible ceiling. It is an immediate, mathematically precise cap placed directly onto the human biological engine. We are deeply conditioned to treat ancient declarations like this as mere spiritual poetry. We prefer to think of them as allegories designed to teach humility. But when you place this decree next to the actual decay curve of the post-flood patriarchs, the safety of that metaphor entirely vanishes. The text is operating as an anomalous historical record of a literal, physical intervention. It perfectly predicts the exact biological limit where the multi-generational collapse finally flatlines. This 120-year boundary is not a product of natural, unguided evolution. Natural evolution is slow, chaotic, and completely blind to strict mathematical boundaries. It takes hundreds of thousands of years to generate massive structural changes within a complex species, but the ancient texts describe an immediate, externally imposed biological cap. It was a forced, sudden override of the original 9th century baseline. The realization should feel incredibly heavy. Our current maximum lifespan was deliberately engineered as a limitation. The 80 to 100 years we expect to live today is not the triumphant peak of human development. It is a biological quarantine. We are operating under a strict, enforced parameter, a locked expiration date written deeply into our cells to prevent the human physical form from enduring the way it once did. The ancients knew they had been cut off from their own vast potential, but a decree written on ancient parchment cannot alter human genetics all by itself. If a hard biological limit was placed upon the entire human species, there had to be a massive physical mechanism to enforce it. Something in the physical environment of the Earth had to fundamentally break to trigger this genetic collapse. To understand how this 120-year cap was violently activated, we have to look up from the desert floor. We have to look at the structure of the ancient sky. We must examine an entirely different scientific framework, an overlooked 19th century model known as Isaac Vail's annular theory, to see the physical atmospheric shield that shattered just before the floodwaters began to fall. In 1886, an independent researcher named Isaac Vail published a model that radically altered the study of ancient climates. He called it the annular theory. Vail argued that the early Earth was surrounded by a massive suspended atmospheric water canopy. This was a physical layer of vapor or frozen water held in a stable orbit high above the lower atmosphere. If this canopy existed, it would have fundamentally changed the physics of the planet. The atmosphere underneath it would have been pressurized, acting like a massive global hyperbaric chamber. But more importantly, this suspended ocean would have functioned as an impenetrable shield. It would have blocked out nearly all incoming cosmic radiation. The ancient Earth was not just a warmer planet, it was a sealed biological incubator. It was a highly regulated environment where cellular damage from solar radiation was kept to an absolute minimum. When you read the ancient texts with this physical model in mind, their strange vocabulary suddenly makes perfect sense. The descriptions stop sounding like religious poetry and start reading like atmospheric physics. The ancient Hebrew texts describe a firmament, a solid expanse specifically designed to divide the waters of the surface from a massive body of water suspended in the sky. The Babylonians recorded the memory of a metallic sky dome that was violently torn open. Deep in the Americas, indigenous traditions speak of an era when the sky itself fell and crushed the earth beneath it. Across completely disconnected cultures, you find the exact same physical memory. They were not describing a heavy seasonal rainstorm. They were documenting the catastrophic structural failure of a global barrier. The historical deluge was simply the violent byproduct of this structural collapse. When the canopy mechanism failed, billions of tons of suspended water crashed down into the lower atmosphere. But the devastating floodwaters were not the true disaster. The real catastrophe was what happened to the sky itself. The protective roof of the planet was gone. The incubator was broken open. For the very first time in human history, the surface of the Earth was completely exposed to the raw, unfiltered violence of space. Without the dense atmospheric water shield, cosmic rays and radiation flooded the lower sky. They began to bombard the Earth, tearing through the physical tissue of every living organism. This is the exact moment the biological clock began to accelerate. The uncorrupted human genome, which had operated flawlessly in a shielded environment, was suddenly subjected to rapid, relentless mutation. The radiation began to systematically cut the human lifespan down. The patriarchs who lived for 9 centuries did not possess supernatural biology. They simply possessed a perfect environment. Their extreme cellular endurance was physically supported by the atmospheric architecture of the planet itself. When the firmament fell, that architecture was permanently erased. The protected world that allowed for extreme longevity was replaced by a harsh, radioactive landscape. It is a landscape that steadily degrades human tissue, forcing our bodies to shut down after just 80 years. We are currently attempting to survive in an environment that our deepest ancestors would have considered hostile and unlivable. The 120-year genetic cap recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls was the direct result of this atmospheric trauma. But cosmic radiation does not just degrade tissue randomly, it breaks very specific components inside the human body. To understand exactly how the genetic freefall happened, we have to look closer. We have to move away from the macro collapse of the environment and zoom down into the microscopic reality of the human cell. We must ask what specific piece of biological machinery shattered when the protective shield was removed. Deep inside the human cell, far past the protective walls of the nucleus, lies a microscopic power plant that drives almost every biological process in the body. It is the mitochondrion. Housed within this vital structure is a highly specific, isolated loop of genetic code known as mitochondrial DNA. If you view the human body as an incredibly advanced biological machine, this specific strand of code is the absolute core of the engine. It generates the energy required for the heart to beat, the lungs to pull in air, and the brain to process thought. But when modern biologists look closely at how this essential engine operates, they find something deeply unsettling. In its current state, it is running without a proper maintenance protocol. When the National Institutes of Health and the Human Genome Project finally completed their massive multi-decade mapping of human genetics, they documented a terrifying cellular vulnerability. Most of the primary genetic material inside our cells possesses highly robust, incredibly complex repair mechanisms. When that standard DNA takes a hit from an environmental toxin or a copying error, the cell immediately identifies the broken sequence and fixes it. But mitochondrial DNA does not have this same fully active defense system. It is shockingly fragile. As the cell divides, breathes, and metabolizes energy, this specific unprotected genetic loop accumulates microscopic damage. It rusts, it frays, it degrades. And because it lacks the mechanical capacity to perfectly repair itself, the damage simply builds up over time, multiplying with every single cellular division. For decades, mainstream science has looked at this cellular decay and accepted it as a normal, unavoidable biological reality. But if you place this fragile engine against the backdrop of an atmospheric collapse, a much darker, much more specific picture emerges. When the ancient water canopy shattered, the Earth's hyperbaric atmospheric seal was violently broken. The planet was suddenly, continuously bathed in unfiltered cosmic radiation. That invisible radiation poured through the ruptured firmament, penetrated the lower atmosphere, and pierced the human cell, and it hit the exact, specific biological structure that was least equipped to defend itself. The sudden bombardment of solar and cosmic energy overwhelmed a cellular engine that was never designed to operate in a high-radiation environment. This changes everything about how we have to look at the rapid collapse of the human lifespan. We have been conditioned to believe that aging is an unavoidable law of physics. We are taught that growing old and frail is a natural, passive decay that has been part of the human experience since the very beginning of time. But the cellular biology suggests something entirely different. The rapid, ceaseless degradation of mitochondrial DNA is not our original natural baseline. It is a specific, accumulating cellular malfunction. It is not the passage of time. It is the physical scar of an acute, ancient environmental trauma. The ancient patriarchs described in the texts, the men who routinely lived for 9 centuries, were not defying the laws of biology. They were simply operating with a cellular engine that was still completely intact. They were living in a shielded, pressurized environment that prevented this precise kind of radiation damage from ever taking hold. Today, every single human being on the planet is walking around with a broken cellular engine. We are carrying a ticking biological clock that was once capable of continuous, flawless repair, but is now fundamentally fractured. We are the survivors of a world that lost its shield, and our cells are still paying the price. But mitochondrial decline is only the first phase of the genetic freefall. A broken engine will eventually cause the entire machine to grind to a permanent halt. To enforce this hard stop, the human body utilizes a second, even more rigid biological boundary. It is a physical cap placed at the very end of our chromosomes, acting as a hardwired, strict expiration date on our ability to simply stay alive. These physical caps are known to modern biology as telomeres. They sit at the very end of our chromosomes, binding the tightly coiled strands of our genetic code together, much like the rigid plastic tips at the ends of shoelaces. Their primary job is to protect the vital information housed inside the cell from fraying or unraveling, but they do not function like a permanent, unbreakable shield. Instead, they operate exactly like a burning fuse attached to a hard-coded cellular countdown. Every single time a human cell divides to repair damaged tissue or replace dying material, that fuse burns down just a small fraction. A tiny piece of the telomere is permanently lost. The cell survives, but the protective cap gets shorter. The biological countdown ticks forward. For decades, mainstream biology operated under the assumption that human cells could simply divide and replenish themselves indefinitely, as long as they were provided with the right nutrients and a stable environment. But as researchers and geneticists associated with the Human Genome Project began to deeply map the mechanics of cellular decay, they confirmed a much darker and more restrictive reality. There is a rigid mathematical boundary written directly into the architecture of our biology. It is known as the Hayflick limit. This limit dictates that a standard human cell can only divide between 40 and 60 times before the telomere fuse completely runs out. It is a hard, unyielding biological wall. Once those protective caps are burned away, the cell can no longer safely replicate. It enters a state of permanent arrest, a condition known as cellular senescence. The cell does not immediately die, but it loses all ability to heal, to function, or to divide. It simply sits there, accumulating toxins and breaking down. This microscopic boundary is not just an abstract biological concept, it is the exact mechanism that dictates when our bodies expire. When enough of your cells hit the Hayflick limit, your organs can no longer repair themselves. Your heart muscle weakens, your skin loses its elasticity, your bones lose their density. What we experience in the mirror as the slow, inevitable process of aging and death is not merely the wear and tear of time, it is the macro-physical result of billions of microscopic fuses finally burning down to zero. But this hard-coded mechanical boundary presents a profound problem when we look back at the ancient texts. If the human body has a strict expiration date capped around 120 years, the ancient patriarchs simply should not have been able to exist. Yet the Masoretic text and the Sumerian King List insist that they did, recording their massive ages with mathematical precision. The only way those 9-century pre-flood lifespans could be biologically possible is if the ancient human genome operated before this genetic countdown was violently accelerated. The extreme lifespans of the first generation suggest that the rapid burning of our telomeres is not a universal, unavoidable law of nature. It is a flaw. It is a broken mechanism. It implies that the original human form possessed an active repair protocol that preserved the telomere, a protocol that was suddenly and deliberately deactivated. The 120-year limit we experience today is a biological limitation forced upon the human species in the aftermath of a global trauma. We have been conditioned from birth to accept aging as the passive, unavoidable passage of time, but the cellular data reveals something entirely different. Our bodies are programmed to expire at a highly specific, mathematically enforced limit. We are living inside a forced genetic countdown, trapped by an active biological lockdown that our distant ancestors did not originally share. We are quite literally designed to run out of time. This realization raises a terrifying and fascinating question. If this rapid cellular degradation is merely an inherited flaw, a genetic scar left behind by a planetary cataclysm, is the damage truly universal across the entire human population? Or is it possible that somewhere on Earth, hidden deep inside isolated populations, there are genetic lineages that still possess a trace of the original code silently resisting the clock? To answer that question, we have to look at one of the most genetically isolated populations in the modern world. In the late 1990s, a massive research initiative known as the Decode Genetics Iceland Longevity Study began mapping the DNA of the Icelandic people. The scientists were not searching for ancient mysteries. They were simply looking for the biological markers of human aging. Because of its unique geography, Iceland offered a perfect closed genetic loop, a population that had remained undisturbed for over 1,000 years. What the researchers found inside that isolated pool fundamentally changed our understanding of the human lifespan. To understand what they discovered, imagine a global network running on a deeply corrupted operating system. Everywhere you look, the code degrades and the hardware fails at a highly predictable rate. But suddenly, deep inside a disconnected server, you find a small cluster of machines running flawlessly. You find fragments of the original, uncorrupted code still executing perfectly, silently ignoring the systemic collapse happening everywhere else. This is exactly what the geneticists found hiding inside the Icelandic DNA. The study revealed that extreme human longevity is not randomly distributed. It clusters tightly within very specific, isolated genetic lineages. Researchers looked closely at the centenarian genome, the genetic makeup of individuals living past 100 years of age. They found that the close relatives of these individuals also lived exceptionally long lives. The capacity to survive the cellular decay that dismantles the rest of the population was not a random anomaly. It was a physical, inherited trait passed directly down through the bloodline. For generations, we have been told that living past the age of 100 is simply a matter of good luck, modern medicine, or a healthy lifestyle. We assume that those who reach extreme old age simply manage to avoid disease. But the hard data from the Decode study completely shattered that assumption. It proved that extreme age is hardwired into the biology of the cell. These rare individuals are not just avoiding illness. Their bodies physically resist the genetic countdown, actively fighting back against the degradation that forces the rest of humanity into a rapid decline. This revelation forces a profound shift in how we view the ancient timeline. If extended life is a physical inheritance, a mechanical genetic sequence passed from parent to child, then the massive lifespans recorded in the ancient texts are no longer biologically impossible. The early patriarchs did not possess magical qualities, and their ages were not symbolic. They simply possessed the original, uncorrupted baseline of this exact genetic trait long before the planetary bottleneck shattered the human genome. The capacity for extended life is not a myth, it is a suppressed physical mechanism. The ancient records were documenting a time when this genetic inheritance was fully active across the entire human population, rather than isolated to a few fragmented bloodlines. The hardware for extreme longevity still exists inside us, but observing a surviving genetic trait is only the first step. If these isolated modern lineages are actively resisting the cellular clock, there must be a specific mechanical reason why. To understand how the ancients survived for nearly 1,000 years, we have to narrow our focus from a broad population down to a single, identifiable biological master switch. We must isolate the exact gene that holds the power to pause the human clock. In the vast architecture of the human genome, hidden among billions of base pairs, modern geneticists isolated a highly specific sequence. They identified the exact biological master switch that dictates how long a cell can survive. They named it the FOXO3 gene. To call this microscopic sequence a mere genetic marker for aging would be an understatement. It is not a passive line of code. It is an active, mechanical trigger. It is the precise biological hardware that separates the rapid decay of a normal human body from the extreme endurance found in the isolated centenarian bloodlines of Iceland. To understand how this single gene works, imagine a sprawling manufacturing plant running for decades without a break. Over time, machines break down and toxic waste piles up. Now imagine a heavy master switch on the main control board. When thrown, the factory halts normal production and initiates a total, system-wide emergency repair protocol. Maintenance systems clear the debris. Broken gears are replaced. The machinery is restored to pristine condition. This is exactly what the FOXO3 gene does inside the microscopic landscape of the human cell. When this gene activates, it sends chemical signals that force the body to stop whatever else it is doing and focus entirely on cellular maintenance. It directs the mitochondria to repair their own degrading DNA. It neutralizes oxidative stress before that stress can sever the delicate strands of our chromosomes. It actively prevents the telomeres from burning down too quickly. It does not just slow the biological ticking clock, it actively rebuilds the gears while the clock is still running. It is a strict, hard-coded defense mechanism against the very concept of biological decay. Here is the most unsettling part of this genetic discovery. This gene is not a rare mutation. It is not an anomaly found only in a few lucky families. Every single human being on Earth possesses the FOXO3 gene. You are carrying it inside your cells right now, but in the vast majority of the modern population, this master switch is barely functioning. It is stuck in a highly suppressed state. It flickers just enough to keep us functional for 7 or 8 decades, doing only the bare minimum maintenance before it is quietly overwhelmed by accumulated damage. It operates exactly like an engine deliberately restricted by a physical governor. This brings the ancient texts out of the realm of myth and into the strict boundaries of molecular biology. When we look back at the 900-year lifespans of the first generation, we are not looking at a different species. We are looking at a human population where this exact genetic governor did not yet exist. Before the flood shattered the atmospheric canopy and triggered a massive genetic bottleneck, the FOXO3 gene operated exactly as it was originally designed. It was fully active. The extreme lifespans documented in the Sumerian King List and the Book of Genesis were simply the natural result of an uncorrupted cellular repair pathway running at maximum capacity. The tragedy of human aging is not an unavoidable law of physics. It is a mechanical failure. We do not lack the physical machinery required to halt the aging process. We simply lack the trigger to activate it. The precise biological hardware required for extreme longevity is already inside us. It survived the cataclysm, and it survived thousands of years of generational decay. It was simply deactivated, lying completely dormant in the dark. If this master switch can theoretically run at full capacity, does the physical world offer any proof that it actually works? If we want to know what happens when this cellular maintenance protocol is left permanently in the on position, we have to look outside the broken human genome. We must look at the natural world. We have to ask if nature already permits this exact biological hardware to run for thousands of years completely uninterrupted. High in the White Mountains of Eastern California, the air is thin and the soil is mostly shattered rock. This is the Inyo National Forest. It is a harsh, unforgiving environment where almost nothing survives. Yet, anchored in this desolate landscape is a living organism that has been quietly running its cellular machinery for nearly 5 millennia. It is a Great Basin bristlecone pine. Botanists call it the Methuselah tree. We are conditioned to look at a tree simply as flora, as a static part of the background. But this organism is something far more profound. It is a living, breathing biological witness. Its cellular clock has been ticking continuously since the dawn of recorded human history. It was already centuries old when the first stones of the Egyptian pyramids were laid. It stood quietly through the rise and fall of Rome. It did not die. It did not degrade. It simply kept processing sunlight and water, maintaining its physical form year after year, century after century. The Methuselah tree is currently over 4,800 years old. When cellular biologists examine organisms like this, they do not just see an old plant, they see a biological phenomenon known as negligible senescence. In simple terms, this organism does not age. It does not experience the hard-coded cellular degradation that humans do. Its telomeres do not burn down to a catastrophic limit. Its internal repair mechanisms do not suddenly switch off after a set number of decades. The tree simply maintains itself. It replaces damaged tissue perfectly, operating under a set of biological rules that completely bypass the decay curve. The age of this tree is not just a botanical curiosity. It is a highly specific chronological anchor. At 4,800 years old, the Methuselah tree dates back to the exact era described in the ancient texts. It took root in the immediate aftermath of the global cataclysm. It is a living remnant from the exact window of time when the Sumerian King List and the Book of Genesis claim human lifespans were suddenly collapsing. The archives say our ancestors were losing their longevity at the precise moment this tree began to prove that such longevity was still physically possible. We dismiss the extreme ages of the ancient patriarchs because they seem to violate the laws of physics. We assume that biological immortality, or even a 900-year lifespan, is scientifically impossible on this planet. But the Methuselah tree proves that assumption entirely wrong. Extreme longevity does not violate the laws of nature. Nature already permits it. The physical environment of Earth is perfectly capable of sustaining a complex biological organism for thousands of years. The hardware for continuous cellular maintenance is a proven, functioning reality. The 900-year lifespans of the ancient world were not mythological exaggerations. They were a biological reality operating on the exact same principle of negligible senescence. The ancient texts were simply describing a time when the human genome functioned much like this ancient tree. Our cells possess the same uncorrupted repair protocols. The capacity for extreme, uninterrupted life is not a violation of natural law. It is a physical capacity that we once shared before a global trauma forced our master switch into the off position. But pausing the cellular clock is only one level of the mystery. If nature allows an organism to simply stop aging, we have to ask a much larger question. Does the physical world offer something even more extreme? We must look beyond a biological clock that merely stands still. We have to look deep into the ocean to see if nature has engineered a mechanism that does not just pause the aging process, but actively turns it backward. Deep in the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, marine biologists have been observing a creature that breaks every known rule of biological decay. It is a tiny bell-shaped hydrozoan known as Turritopsis dohrnii. To the naked eye, it looks unremarkable, but under a microscope, this organism reveals a capability that most scientists once considered a physical impossibility. It does not just pause its biological clock like the deep-rooted bristlecone pines. It actively reverses it. When faced with environmental stress, physical damage, or simply the natural end of its life cycle, this creature refuses to die. To understand what this tiny organism does, imagine an intricate, tightly coiled mechanical clock. The gears turn forward, moving the hands in a strict, unyielding circle. When the spring finally loses its tension, a normal biological clock stops. The machine expires. But when this specific organism reaches the end of its tension, it does not stop. It reaches inside its own machinery and methodically winds the gears backward. It returns the hands to their exact starting position. It tightens the spring to full capacity and begins ticking forward all over again. In the language of cellular biology, this active reversal process is known as transdifferentiation. When Turritopsis dohrnii reaches its fully mature adult state, it can suddenly absorb its own tentacles. It shrinks its bell, sinks to the ocean floor, and transforms itself completely back into a cyst. From that cyst, it grows into a localized colony of embryonic polyps. It effectively reverts its adult cells back into their earliest, youngest form. And it does not just do this once. It can undergo this cellular reset indefinitely. While other aquatic organisms like the freshwater hydra show remarkable regenerative abilities, this specific jellyfish does something far more profound. It achieves true, continuous age reversal. This is not a theoretical model sketched out on a whiteboard. This is not science fiction, and it is certainly not ancient mythology. This is a rigorously documented, observable immortality protocol operating right now on this planet. The capacity for a living organism to completely bypass cellular senescence is a hard, physical reality of nature. The biological hardware required to entirely reset a life cycle already exists in the wild. This discovery forces a radical shift in how we must view the ancient texts. When the Sumerian King Lists and the Book of Genesis describe humans living for nearly 1,000 years, we are conditioned to dismiss it. We are told to ignore the numbers because they violate established human biology. But the ocean clearly proves that those biological laws are not absolute. They are simply boundaries that can be crossed if an organism possesses the correct genetic instructions. What if the extreme lifespans of the early patriarchs were not magic or metaphor? What if a similar cellular reset mechanism was once fully active inside the uncorrupted human genome? The ability to repair and refresh decaying tissue is not a supernatural gift. Biological immortality is a physical mechanism that already exists on Earth. It is a tangible sequence of cellular commands. The ancients did not exist outside the laws of nature. They simply possessed a version of the human operating system where this master reset switch was still fully functional. They had access to a cellular maintenance protocol that we have since lost. If that genetic capacity was real, it could not evaporate into thin air. A biological mechanism always leaves a structural trace. If our ancestors were capable of running this cellular reset protocol before the global cataclysm forced it offline, the remnants of that code must still be buried somewhere inside us. To find that missing sequence, we have to look away from the ocean and turn our attention strictly back to human biology. We must pull apart the vast mapping data of the Human Genome Project. We have to search for the specific dormant code that our modern bodies no longer know how to read. When the Human Genome Project finally mapped the entirety of human DNA, the scientific world expected to find a clean, highly efficient blueprint. They expected a streamlined operating system completely optimized for human survival. Instead, they found a profound biological mystery. The researchers discovered that the vast majority of our genetic material does not actively build the human body. Massive, sprawling sections of our own genome do not code for proteins at all. They sit in the background, entirely silent. To understand the scale of this genetic anomaly, you have to imagine an immense ancient library. You walk through the heavy wooden doors and find extraordinary archives of knowledge, neatly organized to keep you alive. But as you look down the corridors, you realize something unsettling. Nearly 90% of the rooms have been locked. The lights have been turned off. The books inside those rooms are perfectly preserved on the shelves, holding vast amounts of complex data. But the biological machinery of your body is no longer allowed to read them. For decades, the mainstream scientific community did not know what to do with this vast expanse of inactive material. They historically dismissed it as junk DNA. Researchers assumed it was nothing more than evolutionary waste. They believed it was just biological static, the random, meaningless leftovers of millions of years of trial and error. They ignored these massive sequences simply because they appeared to be switched off. But modern geneticists now know that this assumption was entirely wrong. This non-coding DNA is incredibly complex. It is highly structured, it responds to environmental trauma, and it interacts with the epigenome in ways we are only just beginning to understand. It is absolutely not junk. It is simply dormant. It is a massive, silent archive waiting for a chemical signal that never comes. This creates a severe logical problem. In the strict, unyielding economy of the natural world, nature is ruthlessly efficient. Evolution does not typically carry massive amounts of useless, energy-draining code without a genuine survival reason. Maintaining billions of inactive base pairs in every single cell costs the human body a tremendous amount of metabolic energy. If an organism is carrying an enormous sequence of complex, heavily structured hardware, it means that hardware was once actively used. It implies a lost, deeply forgotten purpose. This is where the physical data of modern genetics and the ancient textual records suddenly, violently align. What if these dormant genetic sequences are not just evolutionary baggage? What if they are the exact, forcibly deactivated longevity pathways that the ancient texts have been describing all along? The Sumerian tablets, the Book of Genesis, the Hellenistic records of Berossus, none of them were describing magic. They were describing a physical era when those locked rooms in the library were wide open. They were describing a time when the human cellular maintenance protocols were fully online, running the exact genetic code that is currently sitting silent inside of you. The implications of this altered perspective are staggering. It means our genetic makeup is not fully optimized. We are walking archives of deactivated biological hardware. Every single human being alive today is carrying the suppressed, sleeping code of a forgotten era. Our bodies possess the exact architectural blueprint required for extreme endurance, but the system has been artificially capped. But a biological cap requires a physical mechanism. Genetic sequences do not just switch themselves off by accident. A master switch must be deliberately thrown. If this incredible machinery is still sitting inside us, completely dormant and structurally intact, we must find out what is keeping it suppressed. We have to look away from the broad map of the genome and focus on the specific chemical mechanisms that control cellular aging. We must ask what specific biological lock is currently holding this ancient hardware in the dark. The specific biological lock holding our ancient genetic hardware in the dark is not a missing piece of code. It is a highly specialized enzyme. Modern biologists call it telomerase. This single, microscopic chemical holds the exact function required to halt the aging process in its tracks. It is the literal, physical key to rebuilding degrading DNA. Telomerase is specifically designed to add length back to the shrinking telomeres, those protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes that act as a strict biological countdown. To understand how this enzyme is currently operating inside the modern human body, you have to imagine a highly trained maintenance crew assigned to a massive crumbling skyscraper. This crew possesses the exact tools, the original blueprints, and the raw materials required to perfectly repair every cracking pillar and failing generator. They know exactly how to keep the building standing forever, but they are not working. They have been permanently locked outside the facility they are supposed to fix. They are forced to stand behind a heavy steel door, completely paralyzed, watching the structure slowly collapse from the outside. This exact scenario is playing out inside your cells at this very moment. Cellular biology confirms that the telomerase enzyme possesses the mechanical ability to actively rebuild degrading telomeres. If this enzyme were fully active, our cells could divide and replenish themselves almost indefinitely, without taking any structural damage. The biological countdown would simply freeze. Yet, in the vast majority of adult human somatic cells, the production of telomerase is almost entirely suppressed. The genetic instructions to build the enzyme are hidden away within the very sequences once dismissed as junk DNA. The repair crew is physically present, structurally intact, and completely inactive. The biological engine is sitting right there, but the ignition has been violently cut. This is the most unsettling realization in modern genetics. The rapid degradation of the human body is not a passive failure of biology. It is not the unavoidable consequence of natural decay over time, like rust slowly eating away at iron. It is an active suppression. The human body possesses the exact chemical machinery required to repair itself, and yet the system is actively choosing to keep that machinery switched off. It is deliberately allowing the cellular fuses to burn down to zero. This specific, hard-coded suppression changes everything about how we view the ancient timeline. It suggests that our biological clock was never just wound down naturally by random evolutionary drift over hundreds of thousands of years. It was deliberately capped. The sudden plummet from 900-year lifespans down to the strict 120-year limit recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls was not a theological metaphor. It was a systemic genetic lockdown. A biological quarantine was placed over the human genome, forcibly deactivating the extreme endurance pathways that were once the standard baseline for our species. We are standing at the edge of a terrifying biological reality. The chemical key to stop aging completely already exists inside us. The physical hardware required to live for centuries, exactly as the ancient patriarchs did, is not a myth. It is a mechanical reality currently sitting deeply buried within our own cells, held tightly shut by a hard-coded biological lock that prevents us from ever using it. We have the exact capacity of the ancients, but we have been permanently locked out of the control room. But genetic sequences do not simply lock themselves down on a global scale without a massive physical cause. An active suppression of this magnitude requires a physical trauma of equal proportion. If the entire human species simultaneously lost access to its own cellular repair crew, what forced that heavy steel door shut? We have to look for the trauma that threw the master switch. We must ask what global, cataclysmic event could have possessed the sheer physical power to trigger such a massive, permanent suppression of the human genome. The answer does not lie in a slow, natural evolution. It lies in a physical event so devastating that it shattered the trajectory of our species forever. In modern paleoanthropology, this event is recognized as a profound genetic bottleneck. Scientists studying the deep history of human DNA point to periods of extreme global trauma, most notably the Toba catastrophe, alongside the violent climate shifts of the Younger Dryas. These were near-extinction events that pushed humanity to the absolute brink of total erasure. To understand what a severe genetic bottleneck does to a biological population, imagine a highly advanced network of servers running a flawless operating system. Suddenly, a catastrophic power surge tears through the facility, incinerating thousands of machines in a fraction of a second. When the dust settles and the system attempts to reboot, it is forced to rely on a tiny, isolated cluster of surviving servers. The network comes back online and basic functions resume, but the full, uncorrupted code is completely gone. Only a fragmented fraction of the original data survives the crash. The most advanced programs are permanently locked out. This is precisely what the modern genetic record tells us happened to humanity. By tracking the mutation rates in our DNA, geneticists discovered a terrifying reality. At a specific violent point in our ancient past, the global human population did not just experience a slow decline, it collapsed. The human race was brutally reduced to a breeding population of just a few thousand individuals. In that desperate window of survival, the robust genetic diversity of the early human form was forcefully shattered. The original biological blueprint of our species was compressed into a tiny, deeply traumatized remnant. For decades, this massive population collapse was treated as a separate field of study, isolated from ancient history. But when you place this hard biological data next to the ancient texts, a chilling alignment begins to form. The severity of this near-extinction event perfectly mirrors the cross-cultural memory of a global cataclysm. The ancient accounts of a world-ending flood, recorded by the Sumerians on clay prisms and by the Hebrew scribes in the Book of Genesis, are not allegorical myths. They are the surviving inherited memories of this exact, physical genetic bottleneck. And this is where the biological mystery of the ancient lifespan finally crystallizes. The cataclysm did not merely wipe out an ancient civilization, it was the absolute physical trigger that permanently altered the rules of human biology. The sheer environmental trauma of this planetary event forced the body into a strict, desperate survival mode. The biological repair crew was locked out of the facility. The telomeres enzyme was suppressed. The ancient longevity genes were actively and permanently silenced. We have been taught to view human history as a slow, uninterrupted upward climb toward physical perfection. But the genetic data tells a much darker story. We are not the apex of biological evolution. We are the fragmented, degraded survivors of a near-extinction event that violently stripped away our original genetic capacity. The extreme 900-year lifespans of the ancients were physically real, but that uncorrupted hardware was left behind in the drowned ruins of the pre-flood world. Yet, observing the loss of this hardware leaves us with a critical mechanical question. How exactly does an environmental disaster reach inside the human body and turn off a biological switch? How does the physical trauma of a cataclysm permanently lock down a DNA sequence, keeping it suppressed across thousands of subsequent generations? To understand the precise physical mechanism that forced this cellular lockdown, we have to look outside of traditional genetics and into the science of modern epigenetics. We must turn to a specific, measurable mechanism known to science as Steve Horvath's epigenetic clock. In the year 2013, a researcher named Steve Horvath published a study that fundamentally changed how we understand biological aging. He did not just look at the raw, static code of human DNA. He developed what is now known as the epigenetic clock. It is a highly precise mathematical model proving that extreme environmental trauma does not just temporarily damage the physical body. It permanently alters how our genetic code expresses itself, leaving a measurable inherited scar on the human operating system. To understand how this mechanism actually works, you have to look at your DNA not as a fixed, unchangeable blueprint, but as a vast mechanical control board. Epigenetics are the physical chemical switches sitting directly on top of that genetic code. They do not rewrite or delete the underlying sequence of the genes themselves. Instead, they dictate whether a specific genetic pathway is actively turned on, or whether it is forcibly thrown into the off position. Under normal conditions, these switches quietly regulate basic cellular function, but Horvath's clock revealed a terrifying vulnerability in the human system. Severe, overwhelming environmental stress can forcibly flip these biological switches into the off position and keep them locked in the dark for generations. Now apply this physical, mechanical reality to the catastrophic population bottleneck of the ancient world. When the human population violently collapsed during the Toba catastrophe, or when the climate shattered during the Younger Dryas impact, our ancestors did not just suffer through a difficult season, they endured a near-extinction event. The sheer scale of starvation, atmospheric collapse, and environmental terror would have triggered a massive, systemic epigenetic trauma across the entire surviving population. The switches controlling our extreme cellular endurance, the very mechanisms that allowed the pre-flood generations to live for centuries, were subjected to an overwhelming species-wide shock. To ensure the immediate short-term survival of a starving and freezing species, the human body made a brutal biological trade. It threw the master switch. It completely silenced the longevity genes to conserve vital energy, locking the telomerase repair crew out of the system. This was not the slow, random crawl of natural evolution. Natural selection takes hundreds of thousands of years to gradually phase out an obsolete physical trait. This was a sudden, violent genetic lockdown forced by a global cataclysm. The capacity for a 900-year lifespan was not slowly bred out of the human population over countless millennia. It was abruptly and violently deactivated. But this dark biological reality contains a profound and hidden promise. If these extreme longevity pathways were truly deleted by natural evolution, they would be gone forever. They would be entirely missing from the modern human genome. But epigenetics tells us an entirely different story. It reveals that the original uncorrupted code is still sitting right there, perfectly intact beneath the trauma. It was merely silenced by a broken switch. And if a physical switch was forced into the off position by an ancient environmental disaster, we must ask the critical biological question: could that exact same switch be deliberately turned back on? The cataclysm did not merely drown the ancient world, burying its massive stone monuments under miles of mud and dark water. The true destruction happened entirely internally. The flood permanently broke the human biological clock across all surviving generations. It left us living in the degraded aftermath, walking around as the fractured, short-lived remnants of a biologically superior origin. For thousands of years, this broken cellular machinery has been accepted as an unavoidable law of nature. But today, the scientific world is unknowingly arriving at the exact same conclusion as the ancient texts. Armed with modern gene editing technology, researchers are no longer just mapping the damage. They are actively attempting to reach inside the human cell and rewrite the corrupted code, desperately trying to reverse this exact epigenetic trauma. At the absolute forefront of this attempt to reverse our inherited genetic trauma is a technology known as CRISPR. Alongside advanced modern gene therapy, it represents the most aggressive frontier of biological manipulation in human history. For decades, the medical world was forced to merely observe the degradation of the human body, treating the symptoms of an inevitable decline. But today, the paradigm has violently shifted. Modern researchers are no longer content to just watch the biological clock run out. They are actively trying to reach inside the cellular machinery and rebuild the broken pieces. To understand what this technology actually does, you have to look at it like a desperate programmer trying to salvage a severely corrupted operating system. Imagine a piece of software that was originally designed to run flawlessly, self-correcting any errors in real time. Then, a massive environmental shock introduces millions of glitches, permanently locking away the most critical maintenance files. The physical hardware of the computer is still perfectly intact, but the code is full of fatal errors and impenetrable firewalls. CRISPR is the digital key. It is a microscopic editing tool designed to go deep inside the cell, find the broken lines of genetic code, and manually rewrite them back to their original uncorrupted state. Right now, inside high-security laboratories funded by billions of dollars, geneticists are actively using these tools to target the exact DNA sequences that dictate cellular decay. They are not merely trying to cure isolated diseases. They are attempting to edit the aging process itself entirely out of the human genome. They are hunting for ways to artificially lengthen telomeres, reactivate dormant repair enzymes, and force the human body to heal the way it did before the epigenetic trauma took hold. They are trying to manually switch the longevity hardware back on. Modern science looks at these incredible laboratory breakthroughs with immense, towering pride. We view the 120-year lifespan as a rigid, natural ceiling, and we believe we are finally breaking through it. We believe we are inventing a completely new, unprecedented phase of human evolution, elevating ourselves beyond the natural limits of biology. But if you hold this modern scientific hubris up against the surviving ancient records, a deeply unsettling irony begins to emerge. We are not inventing life extension. We are not forging a completely new path into the biological future. We are blindly, unknowingly attempting to rebuild the exact biological state we lost after the flood. The extreme lifespans recorded in the ancient world were not mythological exaggerations. They were the original, uncorrupted baseline of our species. The ancients were running the flawless version of the operating system that we are now desperately trying to patch. This creates a profound inversion of how we view human history. Modern science is unwittingly validating the ancient texts. By spending endless resources to reactivate these dormant genetic pathways, our most brilliant researchers are proving that the physical capacity for extreme longevity is structurally sound. The cellular hardware required for a 900-year lifespan is not a religious metaphor. It is a highly specific biological target that modern medicine believes it can actually hit. We are simply trying to hack our way back into our own stolen inheritance. But theorizing about rewriting the human genome is very different from proving the clock can actually run backward in a living cell. To see exactly how close we are to unlocking this ancient cellular code, we have to look outside the realm of theoretical gene editing. We have to look at a specific, successfully executed experiment. We must examine a Nobel-winning discovery that proves the biological age of an adult cell can actually be thrown into reverse. In the year 2006, a researcher named Shinya Yamanaka published a discovery that shattered the foundational laws of modern biology. Up until that moment, the scientific consensus was absolute. Aging was considered a one-way street. Once a human cell matured and began to degrade, it was destined to eventually expire. But Yamanaka proved that the biological clock is not a permanent, unyielding system. To understand the magnitude of what he achieved, imagine a highly advanced computer that has grown slow, damaged, and corrupted over years of heavy use. When the system begins to fail, you do not try to patch each individual glitch. Instead, you trigger a complete software factory reset. The physical hardware of the machine remains exactly the same, but the operating system is entirely wiped clean, reverting instantly to its absolute original, flawless condition. Yamanaka discovered that human biology possesses this exact same reset button. Through meticulous cellular reprogramming, he found that introducing just 4 specific proteins could completely reverse the biological age of adult human cells. These proteins, now known to science as the Yamanaka factors, do not just slow down the aging process. They actively erase it. He took degraded, expiring human tissue and successfully forced it back into a pristine, embryonic state. This Nobel-winning breakthrough completely destroys the modern assumption that biological aging is an irreversible physical law. It proves that the machinery for infinite cellular repair is not a theoretical concept or a science fiction fantasy. It is a highly specific, mechanical capacity sitting quietly inside our own bodies. Our cells still remember how to be young. They simply lack the authorization code to execute the program. But this biological reality forces a chilling, paradigm-shifting realization. If the master switch for extreme longevity is still physically intact inside our cells, waiting for the correct chemical code, why is it locked? If we possess the exact same hardware required to run the cellular clock backward, who deliberately turned it off? A genetic sequence does not actively suppress its own survival mechanisms without a profound external cause. This brings us to a terrifying conclusion about the ancient world. The patriarchs recorded in the early timelines did not possess an alien biology. They were not mythological gods, and they did not have fundamentally different DNA. They simply possessed active cellular reprogramming. They were running the exact same biological software that we carry today, long before a global cataclysm forced that original operating system entirely offline. They lived for nearly 1,000 years because their factory reset switch was left firmly in the on position. Modern science can show us exactly how our cellular machinery was locked down. It can map the dormant genes and identify the missing proteins, but the laboratory cannot tell us the identity of the warden. To find the architects of this genetic quarantine, we have to step away from the sterile environment of modern genetics. We must open the forbidden archives of the ancient world. We have to look at the suppressed memory of a deliberate genetic intervention hidden deep inside the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is not a standard theological text. For centuries, it was systematically removed from the mainstream biblical canon. It was dismissed by later institutions as too strange, too dangerous, or simply too literal to be kept alongside the accepted scriptures. Yet, it survived. It was preserved entirely intact, carefully guarded inside the remote, ancient archives of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Today, this forbidden text serves as much more than an ancient curiosity. It is the missing key to our biological timeline. We have been heavily conditioned to read ancient descriptions of heavenly beings as pure poetry, treating them as primitive spiritual allegories. But if we look at the Book of Enoch through the cold analytical lens of modern genetics, the text immediately stops reading like a myth. It reads like a highly specific historical record of an unauthorized genetic intervention. It describes the exact moment when the original, flawless human operating system was compromised by an outside source. The text explicitly details the arrival of a group of beings known as the Watchers. According to these ancient records, these entities descended to the earth with a highly calculated agenda. They did not just share forbidden knowledge regarding metalworking, astronomy, and the advanced instruments of warfare. They deliberately crossed a sacred biological boundary. The Watchers actively intervened in human reproduction, permanently altering the uncorrupted human bloodline. They introduced foreign genetic material into a physically perfect biological system, a system that was originally designed to run continuously for nearly 1,000 years. When you view the timeline through this exact lens, the global cataclysm takes on an entirely different meaning. The Great Flood is no longer just a random natural disaster caused by shifting weather patterns. It is not even a generic, moralistic punishment for simple human misbehavior. It becomes something much darker and much more mechanical. The deluge was a calculated, targeted planetary quarantine. The Earth was not just washed, it was sterilized. This realization completely changes how we understand the sudden collapse of the human lifespan. The rapid, mathematically precise genetic degradation that followed the flood was not a tragic accident of nature. The loss of our extreme longevity was not a random mutation caused by environmental stress or a shrinking atmospheric shield alone. It was a deliberate, enforced biological lockdown. The human cellular clock was forcibly capped at exactly 120 years to prevent an altered, corrupted genome from continuing its unchecked expansion. These suppressed texts offer a deeply unnerving answer to the great genomic mystery of our time. The massive dormant sequences currently sitting inside our own DNA are not evolutionary junk. They are the remnants of a biological master switch that was intentionally deactivated. The Book of Enoch suggests that human biology was actively tampered with from the outside, requiring a massive cataclysmic intervention to reset the baseline of the species. But a physical intervention of that magnitude requires a highly specific physical target. If the global cataclysm was deployed as a planetary sterilization protocol, we have to ask what, exactly, the Earth was being sterilized against. We must look at the direct physical offspring of this forbidden genetic breach. We have to examine the unauthorized hybrid lineage that forced the ultimate biological purge of the ancient world. The entities the texts remember as the Nephilim. The entities the texts remember as the Nephilim are the central focus of the entire biological reset. The Book of Enoch is incredibly specific about their origin. It states that the Watchers descended entirely outside the bounds of natural evolution, deliberately crossing a hard boundary to alter the human bloodline. They introduced unauthorized, incompatible genetic material into the human population. For centuries, we have been conditioned to hear the word Nephilim and translate it simply as giants. We dismiss them as a primitive, mythological exaggeration of tall warriors. But when we strip away the religious folklore and read these ancient accounts through the cold, clinical lens of modern genetics, they represent something fundamentally more dangerous. The Nephilim were a corrupted hybrid lineage. They were an invasive biological anomaly that threatened to permanently overwrite the original, uncorrupted human blueprint. This unauthorized breeding program created a catastrophic biological crisis. The original genetic code of humanity, the exact pristine operating system that allowed the early patriarchs to maintain 900-year lifespans, was being rapidly consumed and replaced by this new hybrid mutation. Once you recognize this specific genetic threat, the narrative of the Great Deluge completely changes its shape. It was never a random, natural weather event. It was a highly targeted, planetary-scale genetic purge. Modern culture has heavily sanitized the story of the flood. We treat it like a safe, moralistic Sunday school fable about heavy rain, a wooden boat, and a chance for human redemption. We have painted over the terrifying mechanics of the event, but the ancient texts describe a reality that is dark, mechanical, and completely relentless. This was a hard biological quarantine. The earth was not merely being washed clean of bad behavior or spiritual sin, it was being violently sterilized. The cataclysm was deployed to completely erase an unauthorized genetic timeline before the original human genome was lost forever. The purge was a mechanical necessity. The ancient human architecture was simply too powerful and far too dangerous to be left running in the hands of a corrupted bloodline. Imagine the compounding destruction of a hybrid apex predator that does not age, a creature that can accumulate knowledge, power, and territory for nearly 1,000 years without ever facing physical decay. Because of this devastating breach, the extreme lifespans of the ancient world had to be permanently revoked. The human biological clock was forcefully dialed down, locking the new degraded genome into a strict maximum limit of 120 years. This severe new expiration date acted as a genetic failsafe. It ensured that if this hybrid corruption ever managed to surface again, it would be physically unable to persist. Our genetic degradation was the heavy price of our continued survival. If a staggering genetic trauma of this scale actually happened, it would leave a permanent psychological scar on the human species. And a trauma of that magnitude would never be isolated to a single collection of texts in the Middle East. If the human body was truly degraded from a state of physical perfection, other completely disconnected civilizations would remember the exact same violent fall. To prove that this memory of a purged, biologically superior golden age was a shared global reality, we have to travel across the Mediterranean Sea. We must open the oldest surviving texts of ancient Greece. We have to look at the exact same pattern of sudden biological decay recorded in shocking detail by a poet named Hesiod. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod wrote his defining text, Works and Days, roughly 2,700 years ago. For centuries, modern academics have treated his description of the ages of man as pure mythological allegory. We are taught to read it as a poetic fantasy about a time when the world was simpler and life was easier. But when you strip away the romantic translation and look at the physical descriptions of the people involved, it does not read like a fairy tale. It reads like a literal, cross-cultural memory of a time when the human body operated under entirely different biological rules. Hesiod explicitly describes a first generation of humans living in what he called the Golden Age. He did not say they were merely wealthy or happy. He recorded that they lived for extraordinary lengths of time without aging. He wrote that their physical bodies simply did not fail and their limbs never lost their original strength. They bypassed the cellular clock entirely, eventually passing away as if merely going to sleep. But Hesiod did not stop with the Golden Age. He documented exactly what happened to the human genome next. He described a sudden, violent degradation of the human form, moving downward through a series of successive eras. In the Silver Age, humanity was abruptly subjected to a much shorter, more fragile existence. By the time the timeline reached the Bronze Age, the human frame had become heavy, aggressive, and prone to rapid, violent destruction. And finally, in the Iron Age, the era Hesiod himself lived in, humanity was reduced to a mere fraction of its original design. He lamented that men were now condemned to grow old quickly, suffering from early cellular decay, constant physical exhaustion, and short, painful lives. If you map this progression objectively, a chilling pattern emerges. Hesiod is not just telling a moral story about metals losing their value. He is documenting the exact same biological decay curve recorded by the ancient cultures of the Middle East. The Greek timeline perfectly mirrors the sudden drop from the 900-year lifespans of the Genesis patriarchs, plummeting down to the hard 120-year biological limit. It perfectly matches the steep, post-cataclysmic collapse recorded on the clay tablets of the Sumerian King List. This mathematical alignment forces a profound realization. These matching accounts are not isolated pieces of allegorical poetry. They represent a shared historical trauma, embedded deep in the very foundation of Western civilization. The Greeks, the Hebrew scribes, and the Sumerian priests did not simply copy each other's mythology. They were completely disconnected cultures, all looking backward at the exact same genetic bottleneck. This global memory proves that the ancient concept of the fall of man was not merely a moral fable about human sin. It was a tangible physical event. It was the shared, inherited trauma of a violent biological degradation. The ancients were trying to document that we survived a cataclysm, but we lost our extreme genetic endurance in the process. But if humanity was truly subjected to a planetary genetic purge, the memory of that trauma should not stop at the borders of the Mediterranean or the sands of the Middle East. To prove that this biological collapse was a truly global, Earth-wide event, we have to look much further across the map. We must open the oldest surviving texts of ancient India. We have to look at the ancient East to see if their scholars recorded this exact same mathematically precise cycle of physical decay. The ancient texts of India do not just record a decay, they map it with the cold mathematical precision of an astronomical calendar. Deep within the vast Sanskrit archives known as the Hindu Puranas, there is a structural framework for human history called the Yuga cycle. For generations, Western academics have dismissed the Yugas as vague spiritual mysticism. They have taught us to read these texts as a philosophical metaphor for the eternal struggle between good and evil. But when you strip away the theological interpretations, and when you look strictly at the physical conditions described in the original Sanskrit, a completely different picture emerges. The Yuga cycle is not a moral fable. It is a highly specific, mechanically rigorous calendar. It was designed to track the systematic generational decay of human biology. The texts describe an initial golden era known as the Satya Yuga. This was not just a time of societal peace or primitive simplicity. It is explicitly recorded as an epoch of immense physical capacity. The texts state that during the Satya Yuga, human beings lived for extraordinary lengths of time in a state of absolute, uncorrupted health. Their cellular machinery simply did not fail. But the Satya Yuga did not last. According to the Puranas, this era of biological perfection was followed by a sudden, catastrophic collapse. What came next was a systematic, step-by-step degradation of the human form across multiple massive epochs. With each successive age, the texts record a drastic, mathematically calculated reduction in the human lifespan. They document a shrinking of our physical stature, a weakening of our immune response, and a severe, permanent loss of our neurological capacity. The human operating system was slowly powering down. This is where the global pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The timeline recorded in the Hindu Puranas aligns perfectly with the mathematical decay curve found thousands of miles away in the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The Satya Yuga mirrors the exact same pre-flood biological anomaly we see carved into the clay of the Sumerian King List. The subsequent, step-by-step degradation matches the sharp, multi-generational drop in ages recorded by the Hebrew scribes in the Book of Genesis, and the final, broken state of humanity perfectly reflects the violent physical degradation documented by Hesiod in his Greek Ages of Man. Across completely disconnected continents, separated by oceans and centuries, the ancient world was recording the exact same physical trauma. They were all tracking the same genetic freefall. Which brings us to a stark, unavoidable realization. The Yuga cycle is not just a history of the ancient world, it is the architectural blueprint of our current reality. According to the Hindu texts, we have not climbed out of the darkness. We are currently living deep inside the Kali Yuga. It is the final, the most degraded, and the shortest-lived phase of this massive cosmic cycle. We are the exhausted survivors. We are existing at the very bottom of the biological curve, operating a fraction of our original genetic hardware. This realization forces us to completely reevaluate our place in the human story. We have been heavily conditioned to believe that human history is a straight, upward line of continuous evolutionary progress. We assume we are the peak. We assume we are the smartest, most advanced, and healthiest version of the species to ever exist on this planet. But the combined global memory of the ancient world tells the exact opposite story. Our history is a meticulously documented record of continuous biological loss. We are walking around with a deactivated genetic inheritance. We are trapped in a physical form that was programmed for extreme longevity, but bolted shut by an ancient cataclysmic bottleneck. Yet, if this cycle operates like a mathematical calendar, then the clock does not simply stop at the bottom. A cycle, by its very definition, eventually has to turn. And today, without ever referencing these ancient texts, modern researchers are blindly attempting to force that turn themselves. To see exactly how close we are to waking up the dormant code, we have to look away from the ancient world and step back into the modern laboratory. We must examine a specific family of cellular guardians known as sirtuin proteins. We have to watch what happens when modern science desperately attempts to reverse the cycle. Inside the most advanced biological laboratories in the world, geneticists are hyper-focused on a specific family of proteins known as sirtuins. These proteins do not operate alone. They are entirely dependent on a crucial molecule known as NAD+, which acts as the primary energy source for cellular maintenance. When researchers artificially manipulate the levels of NAD+ in a living organism, they observe a sudden, aggressive reversal of the aging process. The cells do not just stop degrading. They actively begin to repair themselves, erasing the physical markers of their own age. To understand what sirtuins actually do, you must picture them as molecular guardians endlessly patrolling the vast, dark library of your DNA. Their primary job is to find broken genetic code, read it, and carefully repair the damage before the cell divides. But as we age, the fuel supply of NAD+ slowly runs out, and these guardians are forced to shut down. The biological decay that we accept as an unavoidable natural law is simply the result of these guardians going to sleep. What modern science is attempting to do is to flood the broken system with synthetic fuel. They are trying to wake up the dormant repair codes that have been sleeping inside our bodies since the great genetic bottleneck. When you look closely at this cutting-edge age reversal science, a profound realization begins to take shape. The researchers working with sirtuins and cellular reprogramming are not inventing something fundamentally new. They are unwittingly attempting to solve the exact same equation that the Sumerian King List and the Book of Genesis recorded thousands of years ago. The ancient scribes meticulously documented the sudden loss of an incredible biological capacity, while modern scientists are desperately trying to turn that exact capacity back on. We are looking at two vastly different groups of people, separated by millennia, approaching the exact same biological truth from opposite ends of human history. This perspective fundamentally changes how we view the modern laboratory. We are often conditioned to see geneticists as arrogant creators, pushing the boundaries of nature to build a completely artificial kind of human. But if the ancient texts are literal, these researchers are not creators at all. They are cellular archaeologists. They are digging through the microscopic ruins of our own biology, gently brushing away the genetic dust of an ancient epigenetic trauma. They are searching in the dark for the exact mechanisms that were buried after the cataclysm. The immense lifespans detailed by the Babylonian priests, the uncorrupted golden age remembered by the Greeks, and the 900-year generations recorded in the Hebrew texts were never just mythological magic. The magic described by the ancients was a highly structured, physical, biological reality. It was a functional operating system that humanity once possessed by default, and it is a reality that we are currently on the absolute verge of rediscovering. We are not standing on the precipice of inventing unprecedented life extension. We are simply trying to hack our way back into the deactivated longevity pathways of our own ancestors. We are trying to pick a biological lock that was deliberately forced shut thousands of years ago, attempting to reclaim an inheritance that was stripped from us after the flood. And this realization leaves us looking directly at the map of our own DNA with an entirely new sense of awe. To truly understand the absolute scale of what remains locked inside the human body, we have to pull back from the laboratory and look at the massive, silent stretches of the mapped human genome. We must ask what else is waiting to be reawakened, and what it truly means to carry the dormant code of a forgotten golden age. When the Human Genome Project finally completed its initial mapping of our genetic code, it did not find a streamlined, perfectly efficient biological machine. It found an absolute labyrinth. The vast majority of our DNA consists of massive silent stretches of dark matter. For years, mainstream science dismissed these dormant sequences as evolutionary junk. But as we have seen, the true nature of biology is rarely that simple. We are not looking at a graveyard of useless code. We are looking at a biological master switchboard that has been deliberately powered down. You have to look at the human body not as a finished, optimized product, but as a walking, breathing archive. Every single cell inside you is a library of a forgotten golden age. We carry the physical memory of a time when the biological clock operated on an entirely different scale. The uncorrupted genome is still there, buried beneath layers of epigenetic trauma. It is written into the very architecture of your tissues, waiting for a chemical signal that it has not received in thousands of years. This is where the entire investigation finally converges. We began with impossible numbers etched into the clay of the Sumerian King List and the precise genealogies of the Book of Genesis. We saw a human lifespan of 900 years violently collapse down to a strict 120-year limit. We followed that mathematical decay through the Toba cataclysm, witnessing a planetary genetic bottleneck that stripped away our ancestral endurance. And now, at the other end of history, we find modern geneticists in sterile laboratories, unwittingly trying to reverse that exact same epigenetic trauma. They are using cellular reprogramming to hack their way back into the very biology that the ancient texts claim we lost. The official, linear version of human history asks us to believe in a slow, uninterrupted climb from primitive origins to modern sophistication. But that clean, safe timeline is simply too small. It cannot contain the physical traces left inside our own cells. It cannot explain the cross-cultural memory of a biological baseline that was far superior to our own. The myth is not that humans once lived for centuries. The myth is that we are currently at the peak of our biological potential. And this leads us to a terrifying, inevitable question. If the ancient texts are right, and history operates as a massive mathematical cycle, then that cycle always returns. The Hindu Puranas and the Greek poets did not just record a fall. They recorded a wheel in motion. We are currently trying to force that wheel upward. But if the suppression of our extreme longevity was a deliberate quarantine, a targeted genetic purge to erase an unauthorized bloodline, what exactly happens when we finally pick the lock? What happens to humanity when that dormant code fully awakens and the ancient hardware powers back on? The past is not fully gone. It was never truly erased. We are carrying the suppressed inheritance of the ancients inside us at this very moment. The mystery is no longer contained within a single clay tablet or a surviving fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The anomaly is us. The proof is circulating in our veins. The story of human longevity is not a fairy tale about a lost paradise. It is a biological cold case. Somewhere in the deep past, the human operating system was broken. The capacity for a near-immortal lifespan was forcibly deactivated, but the code was never deleted. It is still there, waiting in the dark. And the real question is no longer whether we can turn it back on. The question is what we will become when we do.